number of things, but I'm going to start by kind of sharing my screen and we'll talk about some of the objectives. My hope is that we're going to do a lot of conversation back and forth. So we may be just kind of moving from the presentation to talking a little bit about just sharing ideas. All right, so for some reason, it is not letting me share my screen.
You might need to log out. Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we're going to be talking about this idea of what's the story that I'm telling myself as we take a look at some of the difficult behaviors we might encounter or some of the more unusual behaviors that we feel like we encounter in the classroom. We've got a couple of objectives. One, we're going to keep asking ourselves this question, and I'm going to keep inviting you to think about this question around what's the story that I'm telling myself, whether that's related to my role at BCC or some of my responsibilities. But we're also going to be focusing in on what's the story that I'm telling myself about baffling or difficult student behaviors. We're going to touch a little bit on what we know about creating change. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of creating change in the stories that we tell ourselves. So for those of you who are not familiar with some of our thinking behind either narrative therapies or cognitive behavioral therapies, we talk a lot about the interconnection between events and the ways that we think about the event and the feeling states that are generated. So let me just kind of walk you through this process, and then I'll illustrate it with a story. So we often begin at this place of whatever we decide is the event or the situation. And keep in mind, when we talk about responses within our body, this can be an event that's actually happening or an event that we're anticipating. Often in nanoseconds, as a result of an event, we generate a thought. Our brains are amazing at generating hundreds of thoughts, often so quickly, it's even difficult to tease them out. The thought generates a feeling state, and feeling states have physical reactions that happen in our body as well. Now, sometimes at that feeling state, we move directly into a behavior or an action, but sometimes for us, there can be an interpretation that we make about our feeling state. And that generates a new feeling state. So for example, let's imagine I find myself feeling really angry at my husband. And at that moment, I judge my anger as something that's not a very good thing for a wife to feel. And so now I've got a secondary feeling state, which is going to be guilt. So when we talk about our experiences of situations, we're not only looking at the thought and the feeling, but we're also taking a look at judgments or ideas we might have about the feeling we're experiencing. So to kind of illustrate this, let me tell you a story about myself that I'm not particularly proud of. I tend to have a little bit of a heavy foot when it comes to driving. I tend to drive a little bit fast. And so let's imagine, if we will, that I've got one of those days that I slept a little bit late because I hit the snooze button on my alarm a few too many times. And that kind of just set up a pretty frantic scenario for me getting out the door in the morning. I'm in my car, I'm driving to work, and I find myself behind this lovely woman who is driving about 10 miles under the speed limit. Now, that may not be a big deal, except I often have a tendency to be 10 miles over the speed limit. So now I'm really starting to feel some reaction to the way that she's driving. One scenario involves me having the thought or the interpretation about the situation, which is, my whole day is ruined now. I'm going to be late. I'm going to be behind the 8 ball the entire time. I might have some other not so kind thoughts. I might think to myself, I'm not even sure why this woman has her license if she can't be driving the speed limit, and the list goes on. Those thoughts are going to drive certain feeling states. In this case, what I was feeling was anger, frustration, irritation, a sense of entitlement. And in that feeling state of anger, I noticed my muscles tensing up. my heart moving a little bit faster. And then I had another interpretation or a judgment about that. And at that moment, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I'm getting mad at this woman and she's done nothing. And now I've got a secondary feeling state of being angry at myself for feeling the way I felt in the first place. Same situation, but let's see what happens when I tell myself a different story about what's occurring here. Same thing. I've slept too long. I hit the snooze button quite a few times. I'm frantically headed out the door. I'm behind this woman again. She is still driving 10 miles under the speed limit. But for whatever reason, I have a different thought process. And I think for a second, I hope that I still have my driver's license when I'm her age. The feeling state for me with that shift in thinking is a sense of calm. I notice a smile creep up on my face. Same story or same experience, very different story. So throughout today, we're going to talk about this idea of what we're going to call deconstructing the narrative. So deconstruction means discovering, acknowledging, taking apart the beliefs or ideas and practices of the broader culture in which we live that are serving to frame the way we think about the problem and the story we tell ourselves surrounding the problem. Now, when we think about working in higher education, there are a number of components that might be important to look at when we think about what affects the way that we're framing the problem and the problem story. That can include our past educational experiences, our ideas about what defines a good teacher or a good worker. Could be related to some cultural beliefs that we have about emotions and feelings and about whether or not it's okay to share those feelings. Sometimes it comes up with the balance between self-care and work demands. Sometimes it's related to what we think the student-teacher or the student-staff relationship should look like. What roles do each of us play in that relationship? One of the things we know as we're talking about deconstructing things is under higher levels of stress, most people become more rigid in the way that we think. And in that rigidity, we get more prone to something that's called cognitive distortions or distortions in our thinking. And we're more prone to having what we call automatic thoughts. Automatic thoughts are often thoughts that happen so quickly that we're not even consciously aware that that linkage has been made. Now, there's a lot of very common cognitive distortions, but some of the ones that I thought might be helpful for us to highlight today include overgeneralization. Overgeneralization is when we take an isolated negative event and we turn it into a never-ending pattern of loss or defeat. So for me, let's imagine I have one day in the classroom that doesn't go particularly well. And the next time I'm meeting with my program head, I'm talking about how the whole semester has been awful in this class. What I've really done is I've taken that one event and I've used it to define things in a much bigger way. Another distortion is something called mental filtering. Mental filtering has to do with times when we sort of don't see any of the positives in a situation, and instead we dwell on all of its negatives. We probably see this cognitive distortion happen with some of our students, right? Who, when they do poorly on one assignment, they can't seem to see the positives that they've done in class as well. For some reason, my computer is being difficult. There we go. So the next one is personalization. Personalization is when we start to believe that we're responsible for events that in reality are completely or partially out of our control. And blaming refers to when we are making others feel responsible for how you feel. So when I say to someone, you are making me angry, that's actually, in many ways, it's a distortion. They don't have that power. My interpretation of an event is what is fueling the way that I feel. And there are two other distortions that I find are particularly helpful when I think about what I do here on campus. One has to do with control fallacies. So control fallacies can go one of two ways. Either we feel responsible or in control of everything in our lives and other people's lives, or we go to a place of feeling like that we have no control at all over anything in our lives. And this is my favorite one when it comes to teaching, is the fallacy of change. The fallacy of change is when we're expecting other people will change their ways to suit our expectations or needs, particularly when we pressure them enough. So for example, I really like Joe. I think Joe is a wonderful student, but I noticed that Joe rarely turns in his homework assignments on time. So I decide that because I expect Joe should turn in homework assignments on time, that if I just keep hammering away at Joe about that, if I pressure him enough, he'll change his behavior. That gives me a tremendous sense of power. Now, my experience has been that when I often try to pressure someone into doing something, it's not unusual that I will get them to agree to do it. I'll get some nice lip service. They'll often say, sure, yes, of course, I'll do that tonight. But it doesn't necessarily translate into behavioral change or action for them. What's really happened is they're just getting me to back off because what I'm doing is making them incredibly comfortable. There hasn't been much useful conversation going on. Again, that's simply my experience. So let's play with this again. This idea of looking at the story that we tell ourselves. So Carter is a hypothetical student in one of my classes. For the first half of the semester, Carter's doing pretty good, solid B+. For the most part, turning in assignments on time. Attention in class varies, but that's okay. But we reach a point mid-semester where some of the work becomes a little bit more complex, a little bit more challenging. And I see Carter not being as attentive in class, sometimes even putting his head down. One of the stories I might tell myself at this point is that Carter doesn't apply himself, that he could do the work if he wanted to, he just chooses not to do it. Now, you could probably guess what the feeling states are that happen. For me, with those feeling states, I go to the behavior of I am feeling uncomfortable, I'm irritated with Carter, I'm frustrated, I'm starting to feel a little bit ineffective in terms of my ability to teach. So my behaviors are trying to get Carter to change his behavior in part because I don't want to feel so uncomfortable and agitated anymore. Needless to say, that process of me just trying to tell Carter he needs to change his behaviors doesn't go very, very far. The other danger is if I'm coming more from that place of anger, I probably have shut down part of the conversation with Carter about what's going on for him. Now, I later learned that the story for Carter it's not a question of he doesn't want to apply himself. It's not a question that he doesn't want to learn. For Carter, the truth of this story, the change in his behavior, is more related to the fact that he has a lot of different priorities in life. And due to a number of factors, at that moment in time, doing assignments in my class was not Carter's greatest priority. It was really that simple. Now, we're going to see a lot of what we often describe as difficult behaviors. And sometimes they're just that. There's someone's patterns of behaviors that they've always had, but sometimes those difficult behaviors can be related to mental health problems, to trauma, or just to high levels of stress. I made a list of some of the common behaviors that we might see, but as we go through this list, I would invite you to just think about what are some of the more difficult behaviors that you see and how do you interpret them? So for me, one of the challenges is when I have someone who seems to have either a lack of motivation or a lot of inconsistency in their motivation. I must confess, I get a little bit frustrated with students who seem unable to break down concrete course assignment directions. Some people have difficulty asking for help. We sometimes see what looks to be daydreaming in the classroom, and it may be daydreaming, or it might be a symptom related to trauma called dissociation. Sometimes it's hard to understand why students choose to stay in the safe zone. They don't take risks in either their projects or what they choose to share. I'm often baffled when a student misses a test and doesn't seem concerned, or at least that's the story I tell myself. Dishonesty certainly creates some challenges. Failure to incorporate feedback. Or even the student who can't tell us how to help them when we ask. All right, so as you kind of talked about, there's a lot of things that can influence how we choose to look at this dilemma about when someone can't tell us how to help. So I've showed this slide in another presentation, but I think it's really important to just reemphasize that there are certain challenges around that asking for help and connecting that are particularly related to people who have either a lot of shame or a history of trauma. And their experience of what it means to be in the world can be very different than what makes sense to us. So let's just take a look at a few of these things. For some individuals with a trauma history or a lot of shame, we encourage them to initiate an email or a phone call to us. Seems like a relatively easy task. For some individuals, though, it feels like they're drawing too much attention to themselves when part of one of their skill sets to be able to survive experience in life has been about hiding and not being seen. So even though this feels like a fairly easy step, it might be a big ask. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't have the ask, but we want to be careful about how we respond to the behavior. Same kind of thing with asking questions. I encourage my students to do this all the time. I have some students who are very, very comfortable asking questions. I have other students who that just doesn't even seem to be a step they can take. For some individuals, this is about how uncomfortable they feel being vulnerable or fears about looking inadequate. Some people have a hard time processing constructive criticism. It's not that they don't want the feedback, but for some people with a lot of trauma or shame, criticism to them translates into, if I've made a mistake, it means my very existence in being is a mistake. When somebody's brain goes to that automatic thought in just a matter of nanoseconds, they shut right down and they can't even take in the criticism. Sometimes students reach out to us and we don't get back right away. For some students, that's no big deal. They understand that we might be busy. It doesn't mean anything other than we're busy. But for other students, they see that as evidence that they're unworthy. For some students, asking for an extension or asking for help is really hard because that translates the story they tell themselves is asking for an extension means you're no good. And here's one that's always tricky. For some people with shame, when a professor or staff is being kind or taking genuine interest in the student, you may find the student pushing you away, and their interpretation of that experience is not so much about your kindness, but it's more about a fear that if you get to know them, you're going to find out they're no good. And that's a real old kind of core shame-based idea. I know that as we talk about shifting perspectives, I often hear people talk about, they've got concerns about what it means to change the narrative. So I want to just at least acknowledge some of the concerns that you might be struggling with. One question is, if I'm changing the narrative I tell myself about a student's behavior, does that mean I'm enabling the behavior? Does it mean I'm coddling that student? I know that often I hear people talk about the fact, well, the real world isn't so kind and sensitive. And having students think that there's this level of flexibility in the real world is a setup for failure. And I know that everybody's tired, that a lot of us feel like we've had to adapt and shift in so many ways that it's hard to think about doing even one more thing. On the flip side, though, I do think that there are some pros of shifting perspective. I mean, if we go back to thinking about me and that little old lady driving the car, I had a choice about staying with this place about my whole day is ruined because I'm behind her versus I wonder if I can still drive when I'm her age and wouldn't that be fabulous? And the flip side of that shift was it didn't change anything about her day, but it definitely changed something about my day. So the pros are often looking at the story we tell ourselves reduces our own level of frustration. One of the advantages here is as our frustration level goes down, we're able to think more creatively and we're able to think about different strategies. It also allows us to have better interpersonal communication. I think, just an opinion, there's also a benefit of being able to recognize our own patterns of distorted thinking. I know when I'm under higher levels of stress, there are very automatic ways that I think. It's often fairly all or nothing. You're either with me or you're against me kind of thing. There is absolutely some illusions of what I can control versus what I can't control. But as I understand those distorted patterns of thinking, it allows me to notice them a little bit sooner on in the process. That ability to sort of reflect, for me, again, is often connected with feeling like I have a greater level of self-awareness and a sense of confidence about being able to have more control over how I interact with the world. And I know for a lot of us, the past year and a half has been a time when there's been a tremendous sense of loss of control. So being able to recognize that I can be mindful of the way that I interpret things and I can change that has been important. But here's probably why I think that this is critical. My sense has been when we can change our perspective, especially if there's some cognitive distortions, it creates a much larger space for us to be able to look at what is the real problem, to understand whether or not, as Jose was talking about it, is it simply that my student would prefer to be gaming? Is it that my student has too many demands on their time and their priorities have shifted? Is it that the student has difficulties asking for questions or admitting not knowing how to do something? But as our frustration level drops, there's more space for that conversation and a better opportunity of trying to figure out where are things breaking down for the student. Again, I know there are absolutely moments that I just want to shake some people and say, but why don't you just change? Really, just do this little thing. It's not so hard. But Pam Farron pointed out something interesting for us about that tendency for people to wait until it's too late to request that help. What we're starting to really understand now is that a significant percentage of our behaviors, everyone's, humans, results from instinctual drives. And here are the primary instinctual drives: to figure out how to avoid physical or psychological pain, to seek pleasure, and to do so in an energy efficient way. So when we think about individuals, this equation varies a lot. So let's imagine I'm a student, I'm doing poorly, but I haven't gotten a failing notice yet. There's a certain amount of psychological pain, but I'm managing that in the way that feels most energy efficient for me by just avoiding the issue. The reason I avoid the issue, hypothetically, is that the thought of asking for help creates an even higher level of psychological pain for me. That's more anxiety provoking to me than the uneasiness I feel about not getting my work done. But then mid-semester, I get that mid-semester warning. It looks like I'm going to fail. Now, the psychological pain related to my grade, that feels like that pain is harder to sit with than the pain involved in asking for help. So we're always kind of looking at how to moderate these things in a way that's energy efficient. Given that we operate from our unconscious much more often than we like to accept, and that when our stress levels are higher, we're going to come from this unconscious place more often, it's interesting to think about, for me, even as an instructor, How often do my behaviors and my interactions and the stories I tell myself also relate to wanting to seek pleasure and wanting to avoid pain? Now, when we add the added layer of possibly mental health problems, I'd like you to think about that when someone has a mental illness, that actually has a pretty significant impact on that energy efficiency equation. When I'm very, very depressed, it may take all of the energy I have to actually click on the Zoom button and make it to class. The idea of making it to an office hour may well exceed my capacity at that point. So just another variable to think about as we're trying to be mindful of the narrative. Now, the other thing we know about process is the process of change includes several variables for people. It's about their motivation, the level of readiness to actually engage in the change, and having the skills and the ability to do so. So when we ask someone, how can I help? And they don't give us an answer, there could be a number of problems there. One, it can be a question of ability. I don't know, or I know, but I don't know how to ask for it. It may be accepting help is very difficult for me. So that readiness portion comes into play. And with motivation, one of the things we know is that motivation is something that fluctuates tremendously for most people, particularly depending on levels of stress. Now, all of that said, I want us to keep in mind that we can have this attitude of someone who's doing the very best that they know how in the moment and still have the expectation and the belief that they can do better. So changing our narrative does not necessarily mean that we're going to enable people to engage in behaviors that don't serve them well, but it might mean accepting that's the very best they know how in that experience. All right, so I want to tell you a little bit about Maria, and then we're going to open it back up to some conversation. So I don't know if you've ever had a student that gives you this look that Maria does, but this is the look that Maria gave me the very first day of class. And I remember as I sat with Maria, first of all, thinking that look is the kind that makes me already on edge and nervous about how the semester is going to go. So the story that I tell myself about Maria is that, first of all, she's got an attitude. And so I need to kind of take charge of this situation right away, let her know I do not tolerate that kind of attitude in my class. But the other thing that I find myself being very aware of with Maria is I probably focus in when she's got that look on her face more than I do when other students are distracted. So I tend to call her out on things a lot more than I do some other folks. Not one of my better moments, not something I'm very proud of. So the challenge for me becomes that Maria missed a test, didn't even acknowledge that she missed a test, didn't even seem overly concerned that she missed the test. So for me, probably because of some of this story I was telling myself about she has an attitude, she doesn't like me, we've already got this power struggle thing going on. My interpretation of missing the test is that this is a sign of profound disrespect for who I am and for the hard work I'm trying to do. So take a guess. How do you imagine that conversation goes with Maria as I try to talk to her, having this belief that she's being deeply disrespectful of who I am as an educator? Any guess on the reactions I would get from Maria? Tatia smiling underneath her mask. So as you might imagine, as I go to talk to Maria, first of all, we go from eye contact, which is just that glare that says, please get out of my personal space. I can't believe I'm talking to you. Again, my interpretation, to no eye contact whatsoever. Fortunately for me, there was a moment where I could pause and recognize that what I really wanted our end game to be was that for Maria and I to have a conversation about what happened, and that the stance I was taking was not helping to facilitate that conversation. So when I could soften a little bit and get off my high horse about this was a sign of disrespect, Maria starts to cry. And Maria talks about the fact that it was an online test and she doesn't have very good internet connection at home. And one of the ways that she's learned to keep people from getting too close is she gives them that look, and she hopes that they just will not engage with her at all because it's really hard for her to engage. And Maria and I go on to have a really good conversation about it. She still missed the test. There were still consequences for that. But I can tell you that as I really thought about what did I really want to have happen with Maria, it meant I had to change some of this story I was telling myself about Maria just was being disrespectful to me. So as I think about Maria, I'd invite you to sort of think about this other possibility. So we can have very different perspectives about how we want to understand some of the behaviors that we see. And I came across this article that was talking about two different perspectives, the student decline model and something called the transformational model. And when I was reading it, it came at a time when I was struggling with some of my thoughts about some difficult students. So the student decline model involves the following things: that we see our students as being less competent writers, they're less motivated than they ever have been, they're less engaged with us, and that the relationships tend to be very adversarial. The article suggested, though, that a lot of this description is really simply the narrative we are telling ourselves about the behaviors that we're seeing. That it's not necessarily a true fact, but this is a narrative we tell ourselves as educators. The other perspective is one that talks about taking a transformational viewpoint. Same behaviors, but very different narrative. Our student population is more diverse now than ever. We have a tendency to get into what we call the nostalgia trap, which is most of us like things to be the way they've been in the past. But it's a trap, and it keeps us from being able to embrace this idea of diversity and change. Things may be different, but in that difference, they also may be better. And here's a real shift: the idea that students have a lot to teach me. This was an interesting one for me because I've always felt this way in my private practice work, that my clients teach me a lot. But it's important for me to also consider this idea that students have a lot to teach me, and that we're all in this together, that it's about all of us learning together in that process. So again, the question I'd like us to just be curious about is, what is it like to change some of the narrative we tell ourselves about those difficult behaviors? And how might that shift the work that we're doing?